Okay, we are live. Welcome everybody to this week's Talk with Doc. Today's a wonderful day. We've got two of my absolute favorite people on today. Our theme today is Special Needs Ministry Master Chef. And we truly have two of the masters with us. We have Jolene, Philo, and Katie Wetherbee in with us today. And I'm so excited. You're going to be learning a lot with them. If you are joining with us on our Zoom call, you can go ahead and put any of your questions or anything in our chat. And then if you're following along with us on Facebook, just put them in the comments section and we will pick those questions up and get it. Everything's open. Go ahead, feel free to put those questions in. Today's going to be a little different. It might be Talk with Doc, but it's going to become Talk with Elizabeth. Elizabeth Barnett, our church relations director, is here. She is taking over for me. I'm going to hand over the reins to her here in just a minute. As I've got to step out. My daughter is in a gymnastics state tournament today, so I'm going to go and support her and cheer her on. But before I do, let me just hand off. Jolene, first, why don't you introduce yourself? And then Katie, I'll let you introduce yourself, and then I'll get Elizabeth introduced, and we'll let you guys get running. So Jolene.
Yeah, I'm Jolene Philo, and my special needs connection is with my father, who was disabled, and my son, who was born with a medical condition that required a lot of surgeries. I also taught for 25 years in the public schools and did a lot of work with children who had special needs, including them in an integrated classroom. And then since 2003, I've been writing for the special needs community.
Awesome.
One of them being a book with Katie Wetherbee.
Yep. Yes. A great book.
Yes. I have it. So I read it. I have it all marked up.
It was one of the books I went through with Elizabeth when she was a resident with us. So Katie, tell us about you. Welcome.
Right. I'm Katie Wetherbee, and I studied special education in college and taught for many years. And then our child had a medical issue that definitely changed my motherhood and changed a lot for us, including church-related kinds of things. So I got into the ministry world. I'm still teaching. I am the learning specialist for a private school in Northeast Ohio. But throughout this journey, I was lucky enough to become acquainted with Jolene. And I am just so grateful because we have had many adventures and we keep on learning about how to do this in a way that really works.
That's right. And I'll tell you, if any of you out there are ever able to come to a conference, and hopefully we'll get the two of them at our Wonderfully Made Disability Conference coming up, but they are amazing when they're together and doing this talk, as well as many others, because not just their teaching, you may actually see them break out their rap. And when these two start rapping, it is a sight to behold. So I always enjoy that. So I can't wait to see that again.
We don't like to brag, but we're
we do have the moves.
Let me brag for you. I mean, you guys do have the moves. I forget the name you guys came up for yourselves.
Oh, I'm Jolo.
I'm K-Dubs, and we're two white mamas with special ed cred.
That's right.
That's awesome.
I love it. So it is absolutely awesome. I do have a video back in my archives with it. It was amazing. I absolutely love it. So with that, I'm going to hand off to Elizabeth. I'll let her introduce herself and then take over. And I'm going to say farewell. And I love both of you. And thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate both of you giving us your time. And I pray that everyone that's watching this today and anyone that's watching this in the future on our YouTube channel, that this really will help you in transforming your ministries and helping you become a master chef in your special needs and disability ministry. So we've got two of the experts here, and so we so appreciative of having you. So with that, Elizabeth, take it away. We'll see you guys later.
Doc.
Bye-bye.
Best wishes for Sarah on their tournament.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
All right. Well, I'm Elizabeth Barnett. I'm the Church Relations Director for SOAR. So it's a really fun role where I get to come alongside churches and help them either start or establish, develop their special needs ministry and do a lot of training with that. And I actually started out as a resident with SOAR, did a 15-month residency. And I am one of the kind of oddballs where I don't have someone in my family that has a disability or a close friend, but was in school and recognized I took some internships doing group homes. And I was like, these people aren't in church. And that really bothered me. And so the Lord placed that burden on my heart. And I ended up here at SOAR, which has been amazing. And throughout that time, Doc poured into me a ton and shared with me a lot of great resources, one of which being Every Child Welcome, y'all's book. And we went through that and talked a lot about this idea of being a special needs ministry master chef. And that was kind of like an interesting title to me. So I'm curious, like, where did that come from? What does that mean?
Go ahead, Katie, because you're the one who came up with that.
Oh, I don't think I did. I think you came up with it. But regardless, we had been talking for so long about the possibility of writing a book together because we felt like there was a niche that hadn't really been covered yet. And that was sort of the how to, just really practical, tiny strategies to make having a welcoming and inclusive environment possible. And we realized how overwhelming it can be for folks who don't have a background in education. And so as we started talking, and I remember where I was sitting, Jolene, when we had this conversation, I was at my little home office and with this reclaimed Formica countertop that we had and sitting there and just feeling like we've got to come up with a way to package this so that it makes it doable and manageable. And I think one of us said, it's not unlike having a dinner party, really. This is inviting people into your home and making them feel comfortable. And my mom always said, good manners really are about making people feel comfortable. So as folks who have been giving dinner parties for years and years, Jolene, we started with that metaphor and started to break it down. And it just really seemed to make sense for us. And hopefully it will make doing this kind of ministry the kind of thing that people say, oh, this is not scary at all or hard. This is going to be really fun.
Right. And our goal really was that no matter the size of your house that you're inviting people into, the strategies in the book can be used by anyone. If you're a great big mega church, they can be used to a medium-sized church, right down to the little churches. I live in Iowa and there's still lots of little country churches. So a church that maybe just has 3 or 4 Sunday school teachers and they want to welcome the child with Down syndrome or autism or who's dealing with trauma or anxiety, and they can use them there too. All you need is to have the book beside you and kind of get some ideas so that every child feels welcome.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, you both have a background in special education and you're both parents and you have all of these years of experience. And I have, ministry leaders that talk to me all the time. And they're like, I noticed that this kid is coming and I don't know what to do. And I don't have any experience. And, speak to that person that doesn't have this background of, can they lead a ministry? And what does that look like?
The first thing I'd say is that, when we talk about special education in a school system, they have to follow the law, the federal laws that are there to get their funding and to ensure that children they're setting goals and they're meeting the goals. And I remember Katie saying at a workshop we did together, she's like, the thing is, we're the church. And our only goal is to show children Jesus so that they can know him and enter his kingdom. That's our goal. And so we don't have all these regulations and things. We just have to show them Jesus. And if you start that way, when you have a child come into your your Sunday school room or your midweek program who has some different learnings that we need to address or behaviors, if you keep in mind, really all we need to do is show them Jesus and how can I best do that? It kind of demystifies it. And you realize you don't have to be an education expert.
Mhm.
You just have to be the hands and feet of Christ.
Yeah. We say to volunteer with us, the only requirement is to be a friend. And I love that. It's something that's really simple. And then we say that we can train you on anything else. And I think that's true for a ministry leader as well. Of someone that's taking this high level position of just saying, okay, well, what does it look like to be a friend? What does it look like to focus on the people that are in this space? And what does it look like to welcome them well?
Absolutely. If we're going to continue using the master chef metaphor, I have people to my home all the time. We just recently downsized to a little condominium, so I don't have a lot of square footage. And I'm certainly no Martha Stewart or Guy Fieri or Ina Garten. But a casserole does just fine, and everybody has a comfortable place to sit. And so it's not about being the expert. It's about opening the door and saying, come on in, let me find a spot for you.
Mm-hmm.
And that starts right away with looking at your space, which is where the book begins, looking at your space. How are you going to make sure everybody can come in? Your space, which is
right. And even further out, into the parking lots, training the folks that are going to be that first face that people see, and knowing that somebody might take a bit longer in the parking lot. Somebody maybe might have a little trouble choosing a space, or maybe they don't have a placard on their car that designates them to park in a handicap spot, but maybe they need that spot. And just being grace-filled to get them in the door.
Yeah. So how can you start some of those conversations within your church of, we want to talk up to the parking lot greeters and to the children's ministry team and the student ministry team and all those other people that have those experiences?
I think one of the things that's really important is to be sure that this kind of conversation is part of the fabric of your church. So if you have leadership, maybe that is a bit divided on this or doesn't speak the same language, and that happens, we can put it in terms of being hospitable and saying things like, in order to be hospitable, we know that some families might have a bit of a hard time getting out the door in the morning for myriad reasons. Those who are raising kids with disabilities know that sometimes meltdowns happen on a Sunday morning on the way to church because a child didn't quite plan for going to Sunday school that day. So being able to just put it in terms of our welcoming community, we don't have to say, well, kids with autism might present like this in the parking lot. And if you have a child with cerebral palsy, this is what you have to know. All we have to say is, let's be welcoming and make sure that all of our guests are able to get in the door and feel comfortable with as little challenges as possible.
And I think we also have to back up those thoughts with scripture and point our church leadership to passages like the one in Matthew where Jesus tells the disciples, let the children come to me, and he puts no qualifications on that. He's expecting all children to be able to come to him, and that's a command. And so our job then is to figure out a way for that to happen. Right. And then if you also look at scripture, especially the Gospels, in any city that Jesus entered, his frontline ministry was disability and special needs. He talked first to the lepers, the deaf, the blind, those who couldn't communicate well, those who had mental illness, and he worked with them first, and then he went to the ones who were differently able and more in control of themselves and could get there themselves. So we need to make sure our churches see that are we doing that? Are we really being like Jesus? And for people, leaders in a church who really love Jesus, that's going to make a difference in their hearts.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of churches that have reluctant senior leadership, and they necessarily don't see it as a biblical mandate, or just have overlooked those passages. How can someone approach their pastor in a way that would be, effective and kind and loving, but also showing, hey, this is a biblical mandate? How can you have those conversations?
I think a lot of times starting with a story or introducing a family can be very effective. And I'm not talking about emotional blackmail in any way. I'm talking about, let me tell you about Joshua, who really would like to come. I've chatted with his mother. Here are the barriers for Joshua getting in, and here's how we'd like to manage that. These pretty easy steps that we can take could really make his family feel welcome. Can you help me with that? That generally will be a more doable conversation than, I want to start 6 programs and I'm going to need 2 classrooms and a sensory room. When we get caught in a lot of jargon, it can be very overwhelming and off-putting to leaders. So just by saying, let me tell you about Joshua and what Joshua and his family might need. Sharing a personal story, asking that pastor to come with you to visit Joshua and his family can also be helpful if the family is willing. We don't do surprise visits like that, of course, but including that family as much as you can in the process.
And I was going to say the same thing. It's the power of story. So you're making the statistics of, 18 to 25% of people have some form of a disability, visible or invisible. That doesn't mean as much as hearing about Joshua or getting to know that senior leadership and finding out maybe that they have a parent who's in a long-term care facility and hasn't been able to go to church now for how many years, and being able to relate those kinds of things to children too, and then also, thanks to the pandemic, we can say, and please do keep your online services going, because people who absolutely can't come to church can join in church that way. It's always that story.
Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely, it is.
That's something, I've loved whenever we've been able to encourage families to even invite their pastor over for dinner, and then they get to see firsthand what having a meal with a family with a disability is like, because it's messy and it may have some behaviors going on that might be a little chaotic. And so we always say, hope that it's not their most well-behaved meal too. The pastor can get the best experience.
Yeah. Another thing that I think can be really powerful, Elizabeth, is connecting senior leadership with the leadership of other churches. So having someone like Doc and Elizabeth connected with a pre-understander of disability inclusion can be really helpful. Many times, larger churches especially are very caught up in their numbers and being able to pay the bills and being able to market effectively. And they become really focused on those issues. So let's speak that language. Let's talk about how the special needs ministry has fortified the church in those ways. And then remember what Jesus said about the numbers too. He didn't go after the 1,000, he went after the 1, right? And we can pursue families in a wonderful way without sacrificing the size or the budget of our church.
I think another thing that we need to really start doing more, and I'm seeing happen. I've been writing and speaking about this for 10 or 15 years now. And what I'm starting to see more is an intentional recruiting of people with disabilities to be part of a leadership team. Mm-hmm. Because when people with disabilities are in those leadership positions and can speak to it, it is very effective. I'm on our denomination's leadership team for special needs and disabilities, and one of the members is visually impaired and is blind, and he worked for 3M for many decades and said 3M was much more inclusive than the church, which hurts. They made sure he had whatever software or anything he needed. But also, even just for me, it's like if we're trying to send documents to each other via email, we have to make sure there's a way for him to open and get the content of those. So for all of us, it's a bit of an eye-opener of how much harder he has to work. And sometimes I'm like, oh, I've tried to send it to him 3 times now. Come on. It's like, get a grip. That's his reality. And we're here to work together. So I need to do what I can do to help him participate fully. So the more people with disabilities, whatever they might be, we can get on those teams for other church leaders to see in action, the more visible they become and the more likely leadership is to engage in including people of all abilities.
Absolutely. And, Steve Gersovich always says that, Peter, the disciple, probably had a really bad case of ADHD. I mean, right? The creator of the universe is walking on water in front of him and he can't pay attention long enough. Paul always talks about the thorn in his side. We don't know what that was, right? As Jolene said before, Jesus always included people with disabilities in his ministry. And we're incomplete as a body without those folks, and not just having them in the building, but having them as part of our leadership, that this is how we do things. I visited a church not too long ago, and we walked in and there was a praise team, as you can imagine, most churches have, and it was loud music. And we immediately noticed that the praise team was quite diverse racially. So, and then all of a sudden this little boy walked up, and he has Down syndrome, and also I found later autism, and he was part of the praise team, and he was waving streamers and having the best time. And I'll tell you what, if that doesn't make you want to praise, I don't know what will. And I asked one of the pastors about it, and she said, oh yeah, that's his ministry. Mm-hmm. And it was just part of the fabric of who they are.
Yeah, that's incredible. I'm thinking about, you've probably both seen that model of inclusion, the little triangle where you're moving from just kind of awareness to actually being fully inclusive and having individuals with disabilities integrated into the body. And so it sounds like that church has really moved all the way up. And I think that's something that really happens whenever you're becoming this, special needs ministry master chef and thinking through those things. And so it's awesome whenever, like, I've seen churches where they're like, well, my church doesn't know that my ministry exists. And so talking through, how can you make it more visible? Things like having people on the praise team, or, making sure that anyone's able to serve and not moving from just being served, but to actually serving and being able to participate. And so I think that's something where we talk about being hospitable, is being able to fully participate. So,
and we included a chapter in the book about that very subject, is making sure that everybody's gifts get used, because that's the whole point, right? And how much more comfortable do you feel at someone's home if you get to help clear the table and you get to scrape the plates or help to, get up into your elbows in suds and helping to wash the pots and pans, and you're part of that conversation in the kitchen after the big meal. That's what we want.
It moves you away from being a guest to being part of the family.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I love that. And moving from looking at this program of a ministry to focusing on the people who are there, which I think is incredible.
And I think it's less overwhelming as well for senior leadership and for volunteers to look at it not so much as this program or this room, and more as just making people feel comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So go ahead.
I was going to say, I think part of it too, when we invite a family over to our home, we don't just look at, if it's a family where someone has a disability, we don't just look at that person. We look at the whole family. Mm-hmm. So what did those guests who were coming, what did it take for them to get everybody there? Mm-hmm. What have they given up so that they can make sure everyone is included? So what can we do to kind of make sure they are included in our home? And how can we kind of take over some of the duties they usually do so that they get a little bit of a break too?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How can we think about the whole family unit and not just the individual with the disability? Because, parents have a totally different life and siblings have a totally different life. So what does that look like?
I think that really starts with good communication, and saying to your greeting team, for example, being able to comfortably say to new folks, hey, we understand special needs here at our church. Is there anything that you feel like would be helpful for us to know so that you can enjoy your time at the worship service and your child can have the best experience? We're not asking for a diagnosis. We're not asking for a medical report or an IEP from the school. We're just saying, hey, we want to make you feel comfortable today. And even if you have a couple of examples, we give out fidgets, or does your child have a special lovey that he or she likes to carry? We want to make sure we don't interfere with that. What can we do? Now, bear in mind, I know that those Sunday mornings are really, really busy and chaotic. You've got one group coming in, you've got one group coming out. So if you can include information like that on a website, because many times families affected by disabilities are thorough readers of websites before they come. They have to be, in order to see what is going to be a good situation. And if the family says, nope, there's nothing to know, and you find out later that, well, maybe there were a few things to know, then just accommodate the best that you can so that family can have a good experience.
Mm-hmm. And I think one thing that I noticed, especially when I was a teacher, if there was a student who had maybe especially some behavioral issues, mm-hmm. there was a tendency back in the dark ages when I was teaching, if there was another sibling in that same building, to go get that sibling and have right. that sibling help the child help deal with those behaviors. And I remember watching that happen to a child who was it was second grader, and I taught third grade. And I thought to myself, if I have this child in third grade, I will never ask the sibling to come in, because he already was dealing with some stigma at that time because he was the brother of this other boy who had these behaviors. And then to rob him of the normalcy of being in his classroom and attending to his own education, that's not right. And so we as a church need to make sure we do that too. We need to let the siblings be children. We need to give them space for childhood, because you can know for sure that at home they have some duties that other children don't have. Having been raised in a home with a disabled father, I knew how to light his pipe by the time I was 7. I was an expert urinal carrier and dumper. You know, that's a skill set a lot of people didn't have by age 7, but we did. And every sibling of a child with some kind of a disability, that's the same for them. So let's make church a place where they get a break from that. And the same for the parents. Let's not go get them out of the worship service. Let's figure out some way, if at all possible, to let the parents stay there, and we'll deal with the child until they can come back. And then, like Katie said, later in the week, maybe give a call and say, what can we do to make next week's experience even better for your child?
Yeah. I would imagine that, especially when we were describing that sibling situation at schools and pulling them out, it's probably really anxiety provoking for that sibling of, am I going to have to go help them? I can't fully focus on my own class because of that. And I would imagine that, that's the same for parents, whenever they're have their kid at school or have their kid at church, and they're wondering, am I going to get a call? So what are some ways that we can be prepared as a ministry to not need to go get the sibling or the parent and feel like we're able to be equipped as a ministry leader to serve that family?
So I think having things like really attractive and kind of current toys can be really helpful. Choices of puzzles and fidgets, of course, but think about what's popular right now, and you don't have to spend a lot of money. A lot of times, even, McDonald's Happy Meal toys are sort of more current, but for a lot of kids, that's exciting and will capture attention. I hate to say it, and oh my goodness, my mom would be so upset, but having a space where there might be a DVD capacity so a child can watch something that's familiar and comforting can also be really, really helpful. Remember, the goal is not to get them through the Sunday school lesson exactly as it is in the manual. The goal is to bring them into a place where they feel comfortable in Jesus' house, right? So let's get them comfortable and let's find out what that is. Having a little menu, just a laminated menu of, different choices. There's television and there's a playground and there's a puzzle and a deck of cards, and letting them just point to what they might like to do can be really, really helpful as well. Of course, we don't want to park there forever and ever, but if we did, would that be so bad? Would it be so awful for kids to have a good relationship with somebody at church while their parents were getting fortified in worship and their siblings were having a great experience? Would that be so awful? I don't think so. So that's one thing that I would suggest.
And I think we need to realize that if we start seeing behaviors in children, whether they have an invisible disability that you can't see from the outside, or kids where you can see it, but then we start seeing some behaviors because they're in a new place that they're not yet comfortable with, our main job at first is just to calm their anxiety and give them a good first experience. So Katie mentioned some things we could have available for them to do. And why not just have a little calm down corner also, where they could just, what one of the most calming things is for a lot of kids? Coloring. I mean, adult coloring is like this big thing for relieving stress. It works for us, it works for kids. We're in an age where there are iPads and iPhones. We could upload some games that are like Bible story related games and have those. And if the child spends the whole time playing a Bible related video game on the iPad, the first time or the first few times they're there, what's so wrong with that? That gives you a little bit of time to get to know the child, to call the parent during the week and say, what more can we do? Here's what we're doing now, and it's working, but we want to do more. Another thing we can do as churches then is, if it's okay with the parents, maybe that child has an IEP in school And why do we need to reinvent the wheel? If it's okay with them, they have access to the IEP. They could show us some of the things they use that are used at school to calm anxiety or to make them feel part of the group, and just start using some of those things. Sometimes the parents might even say, you know what, my child has a really good para at school. That person would be glad to talk to you about what's most effective. Anything we can do to make it a good experience for everyone, we need to try.
Yeah, that's awesome. Other things that I was just thinking about is one of the first questions that we always ask a family. The first question is, what's something wonderful about your child? And we want to ask that before we ever get into a diagnosis or behavior problems or medical complexities, because we want to focus on those good things and remind ourselves of that. And I feel like that puts a lot of ease on the parent as well, just to say, hey, we care about them. And it's been actually really helpful as a ministry leader to know those wonderful things and know they love to tell jokes or they're a really amazing artist. And that's something that whenever they become overwhelmed or you're not really sure what to do, you can lean on some of those things that make them so wonderful.
Yeah.
And
Elizabeth,
go ahead.
I can't tell you how many times when I was in private practice doing advocacy work, when I would ask that question, it was always my first question as I sat down with a parent, how many times a parent just burst into tears and said, no one ever asks me that anymore. No one even cares to know. And I remember a mom saying to me once that she was at a meeting where they were at school discussing her son's needs. And she said, I wanted to jump on the table and say, somebody loves this child. And that person is me. No one was really listening to her. And it's just so important as the church that we do. As Jolene said, we can get a tremendous amount of information from a student's IEP, but the great thing is we are not tasked with achieving all of those goals. We're just tasked with making sure that kid is comfortable and feels safe and loved. And as Jolene was saying, you have a kid to come in for a few weeks and maybe they are playing a video game or they are watching something on a DVD, but they're learning to trust you. They know that this is a place where, oh my gosh, these people like me. And I think I'm going to go back next week. That's the whole ball game.
That's right. That's right. You know, and in addition, circling back to your question, Elizabeth, tell me something wonderful about your child. I think that opens the door then where you can ask 3 other quick questions that might help you provide for a child's needs. And these came about when I wrote Sharing Love Abundantly in Special Needs Families with Dr. Chapman about how to use the 5 love languages. And so these were 3 questions you can ask if you really can't figure out your child's love language. But I think they're good questions because they're going to tell us a lot about how to relate to a child. So first you say, you know, what's wonderful about your child? And then you ask, so what calms your child? What motivates your child? And where does your child choose to spend his or her time? You get
Great
a
question.
wealth of information. I didn't come up with them. A parent had come up with them, of course. But you get a wealth of information there that can probably help you make a child feel comfortable during the Sunday school hour.
And I think that those questions, you never asked about a diagnosis,
right?
And it wasn't needed. And you got way more information from that than ever asking, what's your child's diagnosis?
Because really, as church volunteers, how many of us really are going to understand that diagnosis? And should we? And really, is it any of our business? If we can meet the child's needs at church without really knowing their diagnosis, okay. Because that means we're looking at the child and not their diagnosis. And that's what we want to do.
I think too, it's important to remember that the parents have been through so much during the week. There's meetings and there's therapies and there are battles over homework or trying a new food at dinner. Sunday is supposed to be a day of rest, right? And many parents just want one day where they don't have to think about what life is like the other 6 days. And for their kids to have a chance to be included and even to shine. I had one little boy in a ministry who was fascinated with clocks and precision. And he was put in charge of watching the clock to see when praise time was supposed to start. And did he ever take that job seriously? He stood quietly right by the clock and watched. And when it was time, he told the worship leader, it's time now to start the praise time. And then the worship leader would tell his parents, oh my gosh, we couldn't function without him because we all get so busy with our greeting time and our games. And it was just a great match. So being part of a church doesn't necessarily mean preaching or singing. It can be part of the logistics team as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think another thing that we really encourage I think it's an encouragement for our families and also really good practice for our volunteers is we challenge our volunteers and our staff or whoever is interacting with our participants. Whenever they meet the parent at the door, whenever they're picking up, they always have to say at least one good thing that happens. And that
Beautiful.
it's something where those parents get to hear something good. And it's also, if the volunteer had a hard time, they get a practice of, okay, what is something good that happens?
And I think that can lead us also, if you have that practice, it's going to lead your volunteers to think, okay, I'm going to have something good to say about this child at the end of the day. So I'm going to set that child up for success. I'm going to make sure there's something that builds on that child's strength and make sure he or she has success. Thinking back when I was teaching, about a third of my students in my room would either have IEPs in a regular classroom or be on their way to have an IEP. And one of my rules in my class was that every day, every child would speak. They would say something and contribute something to the discussion. What's the problem? And I would keep track. I had a thing where I marked off who had spoken. Of course, you got the kids that'll say 10 things during the day. And then you've got the kids that would just as soon fade back into the woodwork. And they are the kids who aren't very confident. And so I would come up with something and I would go talk to them and say, you are going to say something today. And I want it to be when you're ready. So, okay, here's some things we're going to be doing. What question should I ask that I know I'm going to call on you to answer? Or here's the question I'm going to ask you. Let's work on an answer together. It didn't take very long. And then they would have something to answer. And, once they've had 2 or 3 days of success, they're going to be more willing when they really know the answer themselves to start raising their hand. So we as volunteers can do that too. So what's a way you could do that? Well, let's say you're going to be reading a little scripture passage and you want all the kids to read a verse. And so you make sure the week before that you send that verse home with that child. Let the parent know we're going to do this. And can you help your child to practice this verse? Then when they get there that morning, you go through it with them a time or two. And if necessary, the two of you read it together as a duet. But you're going to be able to say to the parents when they come to pick up their child, Sally read that verse for all, and everybody heard her and she read it. For some kids, that could be the first time they've ever read in front of anybody else because they're so worried they're going to mess up. So just set them up for success, whatever it takes.
Yeah, that's awesome. So what about for those kids that, have lower abilities that aren't able to read the passage? How can we set them up to feel confident in participating in the classroom in whatever that might look like for them? And also figuring out those like reasonable goals.
Right. So I think one of the things that can be really helpful is having some choices of activities where some kids might like to do an art project. Other kids might rather talk about it or put on a play. Other kids might like to play a game to reinforce the activity. So having a few choices can be helpful. And that means just setting up a couple of stations. So if you're studying Jonah, for example, having a couple of books that kids can read about, having maybe a mural that you can take part in painting a little bit about the story of Jonah, or creating some fish to go around the whale. You can even create a little water game that would go with that. And just saying, okay, now everybody gets to choose. And so teaching those procedures for turn taking can be really important as well. Remember that classroom teachers, if you're dealing with elementary kids, spend the whole first month of school teaching procedures. We don't have that luxury at church. So maybe having the groups walk through with a buddy, for example, can be really helpful also. So really having a few choices can be great. But if you're doing one big project where everyone can be involved, for example, if you are going to work on a mural, allowing someone with maybe less ability with fine motor skills to paint some broad brush strokes of blue, rather than being the person that's in charge of creating what Jonah looks like in the whale's mouth, for example. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's super helpful.
I think another thing that I've seen with a lot of volunteers is that if they aren't educators, their experience with Sunday school and school is that they've gone to Sunday school and they've gone to school. And so they are drawing from their experiences, which is what we all do, right? That's the only way we can proceed through the world until we learn a different thing. And so they're drawing on that. And that what we need to help them do is give them permission to do it a different way. You don't have to have everybody sitting in the circle and go round robin to read paragraph by paragraph this story. You don't have to have your class run that way. Like Katie said, act it out. Have stations, do something like that. Put it to music. Doc, when he was here a little bit ago, talked about Katie and me having this rap idea. Well, how much fun would kids have if you made the one Bible verse into a rap? You've got a child who can't communicate verbally or is maybe not able to read. Why not have them be the rhythm keeper during the rap? They can do maracas, or they can do, the little
tambourine,
the tambourine, or whatever. Expand your idea of what it means to be participating and learning. And I can tell you what, when kids add music and rhythm to anything, it's going to stick with them much longer. And it reaches to every child, whatever their ability. So just kind of be creative. Get out of the box, try something new, see what the kids like and go with it.
Yeah, I think what I've heard so much is the importance of not having everyone have the same expectations of we have to sit still and listen to the story and be quiet, but trying to meet those kids where they're at and whatever that might be, and figuring out how they can be incorporated. I know a little guy who he really, really wants to help teach the lesson, and which is great. And he has his cars that he brings, and he wants his cars to help teach the lesson. So what we do is, I'll say part of it, and then he repeats the exact same thing that I just said, and he waves his car around. And ultimately, I think the rest of the class is hearing it twice. You know,
Mhm.
how does that hurt?
And they're also seeing a person with a disability in a leadership role and being included and using his interests and gifts. And they are going to grow up thinking this is what church looks like. And these kids are going to be together for a long time, past second grade Sunday school or whenever else it is. And we want them to love each other and take care of each other. So what you're doing, Elizabeth, is perfect because you're setting them up to have a good relationship. And my teacher includes him, and he's even one of the teachers for the story part of the lesson. So, you know, going forward, he might be one of the teachers when we get into the big church.
Yeah.
And that's just the way it goes.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And they're also seeing an example of when they enter middle school and youth programs and that kind of thing, where these kids have more agency for themselves. They are going to understand what it means to include everyone. And so the kids with differentiated abilities are much more likely to be included because their peers know how to relate to them, already understand their interests, and know how to bring them in.
Yeah. A couple other things I remember talking or reading about in your book and talking about this with Doc, and really stood out to me was how you can prepare families to even enter the church beforehand, and having, you know, a call the week before that they decide to show up, or having them come walk through the church before they show up, and maybe having a video tour on your website, just to be able to show off the space and having that consistency. And I thought, wow, that is so amazing, because when you're marketing your ministry, but also you're putting families at ease. So what do you guys have any other ideas on how you can help kind of welcome families before they even get in the door like that?
I do think that having an online tour is a great idea. And then also publishing pictures of the folks or emailing pictures. You can also have a social narrative that you can send so that the child knows exactly what will be happening. This is what we'll do first, and this is what we'll do next. And then your mom and dad will come and get you at the end. So that can be really helpful. Also, for those ministry leaders who have the time, and not all do, but if you do have the time, allowing a child to come and maybe even pick a friend to come for sort of like a dress rehearsal. You know, we're going to go to church and we're going to look at things when it's not so busy on a Sunday. Maybe even recruiting a volunteer who is a child, to be that child's guest services buddy for the upcoming Sunday could be really helpful. But we all do better when we have had a chance to practice something. I mean, every time Jolene and I give a talk, we go through all of the slides and we practice and we assign who's going to say what, and we always feel better. So why would we think that kids wouldn't want exactly the same experience?
And I think the more touches a child has with the space before they come, the better. So, you know, you could have on your website that walkthrough tour. You could also then, this is another thing that the pandemic has made a lot easier. Everybody knows about Zoom. So you could have a Zoom meeting and have one person at the church and just kind of go through it all again individually with that child, using that child's name, you know, and zooming in close up in their classroom and what the toys are and those kinds of things. And then, you know, especially if you aren't able to work out a time for them to come in ahead of time. But then also, you know, if they can come in a little bit early, or after the first week, they want to come and do this and practice it again, that's great. Another thing, a follow-up then would be with the kind of social story that Katie was talking about, getting that to them ahead of time so they could go through it. Their first week there, take pictures as they're going through, put that together and send that to the parents too, so that child can go back and look through it and see what it was they did and what they liked. And you might get some feedback about, oh, when we got to this, it found out that he didn't feel comfortable with this. So you can decide, are we going to switch that out? Are we going to try it again a different way? Just anything you can do to make them feel more at home. And really, those kinds of things don't take very long.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, we're coming up to the top of the hour, and I would love for you guys just to share, what is your kind of final thoughts on how someone can be that special needs ministry master chef, if there's anything that we haven't touched on. So whoever wants to share first.
I'm thinking. Go ahead, Katie, if you've got one.
I really like, and I'm probably going to botch the quote, but it's from Mother Teresa, and she talks about, loving your neighbor and starting with the person closest to you. So if I would have any advice about starting an inclusion ministry, it would be start with the child that you know needs your help, and love that kid and love the parents, bearing in mind that we're not doing this nice ministry for you. We're just welcoming you into our home. Let me find you a comfy place to sit.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, and mine would just be, just remember that it's the small things that make the difference. It's not a huge program, like Katie said, with a big sensory room and a quiet space and, all of these things all over. It's the little things that matter to children. Zechariah 4:10 says, who has despised the day of small things? And I think that's so true. Let's just concentrate on what are the small things to make this child, this family feel comfortable this Sunday. And let's go from there.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you both for your time today. I would encourage anybody watching that's wondering, what are next steps for how to welcome kids into my ministry, to read this book, Every Child Welcome. It's excellent. You can always reach out to us here at SOAR. We're here to come alongside you and equip you in any way that we can. And then in just a couple of weeks on April 8th, Doc will be back here on talking continuing education options. That's going to be with Brian Page and Craig Spofford, who are both education leaders in different spaces, and being able to help seeing what those continuing education options are for our individuals with special needs. So thank you again so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us. It was great.
And if anybody has further questions, my website is differentdream.com. You can just go there, hit the contact button, and ask me a question, and I promise to reply.
Awesome.
And if I can't, I'll send it on to Katie, and she can.
Amazing. Well, thank you both so much.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Bye.